Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome to this webinar with Peter Stevenson talking about factory farming. Briefly, though, I'd like to just introduce myself and the Centre for Animal Welfare. I'm Professor Andrew Knight, one of the professors of animal welfare at the University of Winchester. And our Centre for Animal Welfare is one of the university's most active centres. We have undergraduate and master's programs in animal welfare with more planned in the future. We have a group of very active faculty members. We have 9 full-time faculty at the university and 4 international visiting professors who are all world leaders in their fields. And we produce a lot of research and publications and also a lot of external presentations. We think it's important to be very much engaged with trying to advance animal welfare within wider society. And as part of that process, we have an occasional series of public webinars, and I'm delighted today to be able to host Peter Stevenson from Compassionate World Farming. So Peter Stevenson is Chief Policy Advisor for CIWF. I would say that CIWF is easily the world's leading organisation campaigning for the improved welfare of farmed animals. They have offices around the world, a very large and effective organisation. Peter is a qualified solicitor who received an OBE in October 2020 for services to farmed animal welfare. He studied economics and law at Trinity College at the University of Cambridge and played a leading role in winning EU bans on veal crates, battery cages for laying hens and sow stalls for pigs, as well as a new status for animals within EU law as sentient beings. Peter has written comprehensive legal analyses of EU legislation on farmed animals and of the impact of the World Trade Organization rules on animal welfare. Peter is lead author of the FAO study reviewing animal welfare legislation in the beef, pork and poultry industries. He gave a paper in 2018 in the role of livestock in driving climate change at the 10th International Conference on Climate Change, and clearly that's one of the most important issues of our times. He also gave the keynote paper on pig welfare at the 2018 Congress in China of the International Pig Veterinary Society. So Peter certainly does get around, he gets around the world delivering this information. He has written well-received reports on the economics of livestock production and on the detrimental impact of industrial farming on human health, biodiversity loss, deforestation, soils and water. So I would like to go ahead and load up Peter's presentation now. I'll just mention that this will be recorded, so in case there are some who are not able to view it today and wish to view the recording later. That recording will be available on the university's YouTube channel and also the Centre for Animal Welfare YouTube channel. You'll be able to submit questions if you like via the chat column. Peter will talk for about 40 to 45 minutes and then we will take questions at the end. It's wonderful to see so many of you here today. We have had more people book into this particular presentation, Peter being a very influential speaker in this particular area and the subject being particularly important within the animal welfare field. We've had more people book in than for any other of our webinars so far that we've been running using this system since the start of COVID-19. So thank you very much, Peter, for coming to talk to us on this today. I'll hand over to you now to go ahead and deliver your presentation. Thank you. And you are muted, Peter, so you just need to...
Apologies, everybody. So let's start. It's over 50 years since Ruth Harrison's book, Animal Machines, was published, giving us, for the first time, an insight into the inhumane conditions of factory farming. And yet now, more than ever, animals are treated as machines. We confine them in cages and crates and huge overcrowded sheds. Conditions based on the efficiencies of a production line rather than being appropriate for living creatures. And when the systems we've designed drive animals through frustration and stress to turn on their companions and peck their feathers and bite their tails, we, rather than rethinking our systems to make them respond to animals' behavioural needs, we lop bits off them. We beak trim them and tail dock and teeth clip them to make them fit our ill-designed systems. In 1976, the Hog Farm Management magazine said, "Forget the pig is an animal, treat him just like a machine in a factory." And I fear this attitude is still with us, though no longer so crudely expressed. And nowhere do we see our tendency to regard animals as machines more clearly than in our use of genetic selection to fine-tune them to ever faster growth and higher yields. Traditionally, a meat chicken, broilers, would take around 84 days to reach a slaughter weight of some 2 kilos. That wasn't good enough for us, too slow. And so we harnessed genetic selection to drive accelerated growth rates. And today, broilers reach a slaughter weight of 2.2 kilos in just 35 days. They've gone down from 84 to 35 days. Modern broilers are growing over twice as quickly as 60 years ago. What grows quickly is the muscle, the meat, but the supporting structure of legs, heart and circulatory system are unable to keep pace with the rapid body growth, often buckling under the strain of supporting it. And each year, hundreds of millions of broilers are suffering from painful leg disorders, while others succumb to heart disease. And these problems generate another problem. The broilers reared for meat reach their slaughter weight in just 5 weeks, but the broiler breeders need to survive till the age of sexual maturity at 18 weeks and remain fit enough to breed. And so, but because of their very fast growth rates, the breeders are so prone to health problems that many would die before reaching adulthood. And the industry's solution is to slow down the growth rate by feeding them on restricted rations. They're given just 1/3 to eat of what they would eat normally. And researchers say this leaves them chronically hungry, frustrated, and stressed. And I want to look at the egg sector, which is a totally different flock from the chickens used to produce meat. The red jungle fowl, the wild birds from which today's layers are descended, produce around 20 eggs a year. But this is not enough for our appetite. And by the 1930s, we had selectively bred hens that laid 130 eggs a year. Still not enough. And so we pushed on and bred hens that today lay over 300 eggs a year. This comes at a cost. The Farm Animal Welfare Council, FAWC, says that genetic selection for high egg yield causes osteoporosis and results in the hens being very vulnerable to bone fractures. FAWC says that the need of these high-yielding hens for calcium to form eggshells exceeds their body weight by about 30 times. Falk says it's questionable whether it's possible to maintain a yield of 30 eggs in a laying, of 300 eggs in a laying cycle, while attaining bone strength sufficient to reduce these hens' vulnerability to bone fractures. Further problems arise because of our insistence on having high yields of both eggs and meat. To attain this, in the 1950s, the industry split into two, and some chickens were bred to lay huge numbers of eggs, while others were selected for rapid body growth to produce huge amounts of meat. But this leaves no role for the male chicks born into the egg flock. They can't lay eggs, and they're the wrong body type to produce large amounts of meat. And so each year, worldwide, hundreds of millions of day-old male chicks are killed, gassed or macerated. And any industry which produces huge numbers of animals which are then killed is in need of fundamental restructuring. Our unquenchable desire for more is not confined to the poultry sector. A cow producing milk for her calf would produce about 1,000 litres in her 10-month lactation. But commercial dairy cows have been genetically selected for much higher yields. They produce on average 7,000 litres a year. And that was still not enough. And so again, we pushed on. And now many cows produce 10,000 litres a year, sometimes even 12,000 litres. But again, this comes at a cost. In a report for the European Parliament, Professor Broom said that dairy cows producing large amounts of milk have high levels of leg disorders, mastitis, and reproductive disorders. And the proportion of cows affected by one or more of these disorders is high. And the animals live with these welfare problems for a substantial part of their lives. After about just 4 lactations, many cows are utterly exhausted and infertile. And an infertile cow can't produce a calf and so can't produce milk, and so is prematurely slaughtered. A worn-out milk machine cast aside. Rather like the poultry sector, the cattle industry has to some degree split into two. And male calves born into the dairy sector can't produce milk and are sometimes not particularly well suited for beef production. And so each year, tens of thousands of male dairy calves are shot shortly after birth, the unwanted byproducts of a ruthless industry. I'm amazed that the dairy industry is able to retain its wholesome, benign image. Perhaps the triumph of marketing over reality. In 1978, another hog farming magazine said, breeding sows should be thought of and treated as highly valuable pieces of machinery whose role is to pump out baby pigs like a sausage machine. But that was long ago, 1978. But in 2021, the website of a major pig breeding company says, our sows are bred to maximize pounds of weaned pigs per year. This results in a higher number of piglets per sow per lifetime. And on their website, they say, below is our top selling female product. And yes, pigs too have been blighted by the drive for higher productivity. Till a few decades ago, the average litter size of a sow was about 9. But genetic selection has raised this to 17, to 14 in many countries, and in Denmark to almost 17. And giving birth to such large litters is a protracted process, and sows may suffer from prolonged pain, exhaustion and stress. And such large litters increase the risk of mortality for piglets due to low birth weight or starvation as they're unable to find a teat. We've actually bred sows that produce more piglets than they have teats to feed them with. And in such large litters, piglets may, as they compete with one another for teats, damage those teats and the faces of their litter mates. And to prevent this, farmers clip or grind the piglet's teeth, which is a painful process. This mechanistic approach to animals has consequences. The crowded, stressful conditions of factory farming play an important part in the emergence, spread and amplification of pathogens, some of which are zoonotic, i.e. can be transferred from animals to people. A joint scientific opinion by the European Medicines Agency and the European Food Safety Authority says that the stress associated with intensive indoor large-scale production can increase the risk of livestock contracting disease. And in a report entitled Preventing the Next Pandemic, UN Environment and the International Livestock Research Institute said that unsustainable agricultural intensification and increasing demand for animal protein are major drivers of zoonotic disease emergence. And indeed, the last pandemic before COVID originated in farm animals. The 2009 swine flu pandemic started in La Gloria, Mexico, just 5 miles from a major concentration of industrial pig farms. Pigs can be affected by both avian and human influenza viruses, as well as pig influenza viruses, and they act as a mixing machine in which the genes from these various viruses can be swapped, and new viruses that are a mix of human, bird and pig viruses can emerge. This appears to have been the process behind the 2009 swine flu pandemic, which went on to kill between 150,000 and over 500,000 people. The 1999 Nipah virus in Malaysia was associated with the increasing size and density of commercial pig farms and their encroachment into forested areas. The virus appears to have been transmitted from fruit bats to pigs and then from them to people. The OIE, the World Organization for Animal Health, says the Nipah virus has devastating pandemic potential. The World Organization for Human Health estimates the case mortality with the Nipah virus of between 40 to 75%. A recent study took samples from almost 2,500 European pig farms, and they found a year-round presence of up to 4 major swine influenza virus lineages in over half of the farms surveyed. And the researchers conclude that European swine populations represent reservoirs for emerging influenza A virus strains with zoonotic or perhaps pre-pandemic potential. And indeed, the highlights of their study say that European swine populations host building blocks of pre-pandemic influenza viruses. The intensive poultry sector loves to claim that bird flu is spread by wild birds. But the bird flu that circulates naturally among wild birds is usually of low pathogenicity. It generally does little harm to the birds. It's when it gets into industrial poultry sheds that low pathogenic avian influenza can evolve into dangerous high pathogenic avian influenza. Industrial poultry production, in which thousands of birds are crammed into a shed, gives a virus a constant supply of new hosts. It's able to move among the birds very quickly, perhaps mutating as it does so. And in such a situation, highly virulent new strains are likely to rapidly emerge. Industrial agriculture can also have an indirect impact on the emergence of new viruses. Industrial livestock production needs huge amounts of cereals and soy to feed the animals, and this leads to expansion of farmland into forests and other wildlife habitats, resulting in ecosystem disruption and biodiversity loss, both of which can increase pathogen spillover. And these factors, together with closer contact between people and wild animals, can lead to the transmission of viruses from wild animals to people, perhaps through an intermediate host, such as pigs. And indeed, a report by the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services identifies the underlying causes of pandemics as including agricultural expansion and intensification. I'm amazed that after a year of being engulfed by COVID, no one in government is questioning the wisdom of continuing to keep animals in conditions which could spark the next pandemic. So how have we got to the point, both in the UK and globally, where factory farming so dominates animal agriculture? Well, the opening lines of the programme Chernobyl resonate here. What is the cost of lies? It's not that we'll mistake them for the truth. The real danger is that if we hear enough lies, then we no longer recognise the truth at all. So what are the lies, half-truths and obfuscations that keep factory farming afloat? Well, the UK government claims that we have some of the highest animal welfare standards in the world, even though in reality we are rapidly falling behind other countries. 42% of UK hens are kept in enriched cages, but Austria's ban on these cages is already in force. Germany's comes into force in 2025, the Czech Republic's in 2027, Slovakia's in 2030. France has already prohibited the installation of any new cages. Over half of UK sows are kept in farrowing crates for 10 weeks or more each year. But these crates have been banned for many years in Switzerland, Sweden and Norway. Germany, one of the two largest pig producers in Europe, has banned these crates from 2035. Austria from 2033. But in the UK, we still cling to our cages and crates. And the government says we have some of the highest welfare standards in the world. But this is an answer to the wrong question. It's a verbal sleight of hand designed to prevent us from asking the right question, which is, are our standards sufficient to ensure that animals have a life worth living? And the answer to this question is no, they're not. They fall a very long way short of what is needed to ensure good welfare. Humane slaughter is a term designed to reassure us that animals are properly treated at slaughter, perhaps that they're gently put to sleep, rather like the family pet at the end of her life. But the reality is not like this. Animals are hustled through slaughterhouses at great speed. At slaughter, they experience pain, fear, terror, distress. A favourite obfuscation is to say it doesn't matter in what systems animals are raised, the key factor is the quality of the stock person. But this ignores the fact that extensive systems have the potential, if well designed and well managed, to deliver good welfare, while industrial systems, even with first-rate stock persons, have little or no potential for producing satisfactory welfare. And then we come to the two big bastions of factory farming, the twin myths of necessity and efficiency. We're told that we need to produce 70% more food to feed the growing world population, and that therefore further industrialization of livestock production is necessary. But we already produce more than enough food to feed the world population that is expected to reach 9.8 billion by 2050. The problem is that 60% of the food we produce is lost or wasted, either through post-harvest losses or being discarded by retailers or consumers, or through overconsumption beyond our nutritional needs, and crucially by the use of human edible cereals and soy to feed animals, who convert them very inefficiently into meat and milk. If we just halved all these various forms of loss and waste, we could feed an extra 3.5 billion people, much more than the anticipated increase in world population of 2.2 billion by 2050. And then we're told that factory farming is efficient. But it's staggeringly inefficient. The European Commission says that almost 2/3 of EU cereals are used to feed animals. Globally, the figure is 40 to 45%. But for every 100 calories of human edible cereals fed to animals, just 17 to 30 calories enter the human food chain as meat or milk. And for every 100 grams of protein in human edible cereals fed to animals, just 43 grams of protein enter the human food chain as meat or milk. This is inefficiency on a world-class stage. And then we're told we have to meet consumer demand, as if that demand had arisen unbidden within consumers, rather than being shaped and manipulated by years of seductive advertising. And then we're told industrial farming gives us cheap food. And indeed, factory farmed meat and milk are cheap at the supermarket checkout. But the low price of these products is achieved only by an economic sleight of hand. We've devised a distorting economic system that takes account of some costs, such as housing and feeding the animals, while ignoring others, such as the detrimental impact on the environment and health of industrial agriculture. This problem is recognised by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. They've said that in many countries there's a worrying disconnect between the retail price of food and the true cost of its production. And as a result, food produced at great environmental cost in the form of greenhouse gas emissions, air and water pollution, and habitat destruction can appear to be cheaper than more sustainably produced alternatives. And these detrimental impacts are referred to by economists as negative externalities. They represent a market failure because the costs associated with them are not included in the price paid by farmers for inputs or the price paid by consumers of livestock products. Instead, these costs are borne by third parties, taxpayers, or society as a whole. In some cases, the costs are borne by no one, and key resources such as soils and biodiversity are allowed to deteriorate, so undermining the ability of future generations to feed themselves. And the negative externalities of the food system are immense. A report by the Food and Land Use Coalition estimates them to be almost $12 trillion a year, rising to 16 trillion by 2050. This isn't remotely cheap food. And the same report estimates that the economic benefits of moving to healthy diets and regenerative agriculture would far outweigh the cost of doing so. And all these lies and half-truths lock us into the status quo, making it appear as if it is the only way of doing things, but it's not. If we want to change and minimize the risk of future pandemics and save our antibiotics, we need to move to health-oriented systems for rearing animals, systems in which good health is inherent in the farming method, rather than being propped up by routine antibiotic use. So what would these health-oriented systems look like? Well, they would avoid overcrowding, as high stocking density is a risk factor for the spread and amplification of pathogens. They would minimize stress, as this undermines animals' immune systems, making them susceptible to disease. They would ensure that animals can engage in their natural behaviours, as inability to do so is stressful. There'd be no early weaning of pigs, as this involves several stressors, including premature separation from the sow, mixing with unfamiliar pigs, and having to get accustomed to a new diet and new housing. Health-oriented systems I'm hoping you can still hear me because my screen has frozen again, so I may have to proceed without the PowerPoint. Health-oriented systems would also avoid excessive group size, excessive herds and flocks, as this can accelerate the transmission of disease. They would also avoid mixing of different groups of animals, because this can lead to disease being passed from one group to another. They would ensure good air quality, such as low levels of dust, ammonia and carbon dioxide, as poor air quality can lead to respiratory disease. And they would avoid the use of animals genetically selected for high yields, as these animals are vulnerable to metabolic and immunological problems. Again, slide's still not working, so I'll press on without. If we want to change, we need to understand where the power that shapes our food systems lies. It rests with the huge multinationals that provide the inputs for industrial agriculture. These include the manufacturers of chemical pesticides and fertilizers, and the providers of hybrid seeds used in monocultures. They include the manufacturers of animal pharmaceuticals, including antibiotics, that are used to prop up factory farming. They include the big breeding companies that provide the fast-growing broilers, the high-yielding cows and hens, and the hyper-prolific sows with their huge litter sizes. And it includes the manufacturers of farm equipment, such as the cages and crates used to confine industrially reared animals. And it includes the big global grain traders and feed producers who provide all the cereals and soy used to feed factory farmed animals. For all these big companies, their business model is totally dependent on industrial agriculture. If we were to move to regenerative agriculture, farmers would still be needed, but demand for the products of these multinationals would decline dramatically. And so they use their power to influence policymakers and obstruct reform. They're able to shape the narratives that entrench the status quo, such as industrial agriculture gives us cheap food or is vital to feed the world. Earlier, I explained that once one takes one wrong turn, such as driving animals to excessive yields, major problems arise and other wrong turns are then taken, killing unwanted calves and chicks and feeding broiler breeders on restricted diets. The suffering is immense. Hunger, painful lameness, heart failure, bone fractures. The only solution is to turn round and track one's way back to the first wrong turn, and then create a fresh path, a new approach to farming that recognizes animals as sentient beings whose needs, wants, and well-being must be fully respected. And the first step on this path is to recognise that good welfare entails not just preventing negative factors, but also providing opportunities for animals to have positive experiences. Fresh air, daylight, the warmth of the sun on their backs, the feel of the breeze moving across their bodies, pleasure, confidence, a sense of control, caring for their young, being raised by their mothers. Scientists increasingly recognize the importance for the physical and mental well-being of animals to be able to engage in investigation, exploration, problem solving, play. The next step on the path is to recognize that each animal is an individual with her or his own qualities and characteristics. Peter Roberts, the founder of Compassion in World Farming, said that factory farming begins when one loses sight of animals as individuals. Treating animals as sentient beings is crucial, but is perhaps just a way station along the path to the real destination, regarding animals as fellow creatures. And here we need to be accompanied not just by the results of scientific research, but by other insights into the true nature of animals. In his book, The Whole Hog, Lyle Watson said, "I know of no other animals who are more consistently curious, more willing to engage in new experiences, more ready to meet the world with open-mouthed enthusiasm. Pigs are incurable optimists and get a big kick out of just being." And in the 4th century, St. Basil of Caesarea said, "May we realize that they live not for us alone, but for themselves and for thee, and that they love the sweetness of life even as we, and that they serve thee better in their place than we in ours." And in the film The Last Pig, the former pig producer Bob Commis said, "After 10 years of looking into thousands of pig eyes, I've come to understand that they're never vacant. There's always someone looking back at me." He said, "Pigs are incredibly complex creatures. They're animals, not machines. There's always someone looking back at me." I think that's a good note on which to end. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter, for that wonderful review of the welfare problems associated with various intensive farming systems, and also the risks of transmissible diseases, zoonotic diseases, and indeed pandemics that can arise from some of those. Thank you for particularly struggling on despite your technological problems at your end. I have to say, having experienced some of those myself as a speaker, I've never been able to eloquently come up with entire quotes when my PowerPoint freezes. So I was very impressed indeed at how you managed to do that, and thank you very much indeed. That was actually fantastic. Look, we've had a number of really interesting questions coming in, so I'm afraid we're probably not going to be able to get through all of them, because there are quite a few. So I'm going to start roughly in order of those questions and ask you some of the questions that have come in from our audience. So Clara asks, with dairy, there is basically no profit to be made because it's subsidised by the government. Do you think that products should be priced a lot higher to fund the implementation of better animal welfare standards? And she notes that a litre of Coca-Cola actually costs more than a litre of milk, and she, considering the hardships that go into dairy farming, and arguably that's both for the people involved, but particularly for the animals involved, she thinks that's very unethical. So what do you think? Do you think the products ought to be priced a lot higher, and would that help the implementation of better standards, Peter?
Right, firstly, it's not farmers' fault that these problems go on, though there are some bad and some good farmers. But what I was trying, I think, to point to is a system is involved which is trapping people. And yes, probably meat and milk should be more expensive, or to be more specific, I touched upon this problem of negative externalities. The solution to this is to introduce taxes on the bad things, the unhealthy, the environmentally damaging, but to use all of the revenue raised to reduce the price of healthy, humane, environmentally sustainable food. Absolutely vital that the cost of food doesn't go up, but let's shift so we're increasing the price of the bad stuff, lowering the price of the good. The former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, Olivier de Schutter, said that any society in which healthy food is more expensive than unhealthy food is a society that must mend its price system. That's a lovely phrase. We need to mend our price system. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. There's another one kind of in the same vein from Anonymous. Anonymous has asked more than one question, I suspect, but nevertheless, that's great. Everyone's welcome, including Anonymous. This question relates to farmers, talking about the livelihood of farmers tied to the industry, and asks what alternative can we give them to reduce production, become extensive rather than intensive in their farming? And how do we persuade the consumer to eat less meat but pay more for more ethically produced meat?
Gosh, right, okay. The government has said that post-Brexit they're wanting to be using subsidies that will really help farmers move to better systems. My worry at the moment, from what we're hearing so far, is that many farmers, not all, but many, just want subsidies used just for minor improvements to the status quo. The government's got to be courageous and say, no, we are really going to help farmers who want to move to really very different systems. And again, at the end of the talk, I was trying to say we need, if we're going to move out of being trapped in this status quo, we really need very radically different approaches to farming, and certainly, much less consumption of meat, but higher quality meat. All
right then. We've had a question from Imar, who critiques the concept of animal welfare, and Imar says that the concept of welfare is rooted in an industrial logic of productivity. Its definition in the literature is ambiguous, and this is compounded by marketing campaigns. So how much do you think that the definition of animal welfare, perhaps the obfuscation of that by marketing campaigns and the changing definition over time, is part of the problem here associated with the poor welfare of these animals? I think that's if I followed the question correctly, I think it's a really good question. Because yes, I think what's happened is that animal welfare, it's how the government can get away with saying we've got high animal welfare standards, a very limited notion of what we mean. I've had senior academics in public discussions say to me, look, there's nothing wrong with indoor production of dairy cows. We can keep lameness as low indoor as outdoors. And my reaction to this, yes, but there's more, vital though it is not to be lame, there's more to a dairy cow's well-being than not being lame. And so, yes, I think, again, I try to touch upon this. I try to say, look, we have to realise that welfare is about providing positive experiences. We have to, and this would totally
mean rethinking our farming system, recognise that each animal is an individual. The one slide I regretted not being able to use near the end was I had a lovely picture of a cow looking really happy in a field with a very traditional wildflowers, and I said, trying to talk about, you know, animals, individuals, this isn't just a cow, it's Daisy, a one-off, a unique entity. So yeah, we have to think of welfare as including positive, as including animals as individuals. And I tried to float the idea that though vital this concept of sentient beings is, we need to move on from that to fellow creatures. Sentient beings still has this slight feeling of us being the dominant and, you know, us doing well by the animal, rather than recognizing a sense of equality. So yeah, to answer sorry, I'm giving very long answers, but the answer is yes, the concept of animal welfare as currently elaborated is possibly damaging.
Thanks, Peter. This question comes from Lucy, who I suspect is a lawyer. She asks, what can we as lawyers in the UK do to ensure better welfare for animals in the first instance, and in the long term, something more akin to animal liberation? And she also asks, do you recommend any countries or organisations which are leading in this field?
Do you think she means from the, you know, legal organisations?
Yeah, yes, I would think so. Legal action for animals.
I think in the UK and Europe, we as lawyers, because I'm a solicitor by background, haven't really done enough. It's not to say that we've not done anything, but I think in the US and Australia, there's much more focus on how we can use the law to improve animal welfare. And I think we should be using the law much more to bring judicial review proceedings to challenge government when, you know, when they're acting unlawfully or not really advancing the cause of animal welfare. So yes, I think that the law has, you know, a real role to play. If the questioner wants to contact me at peter@ciwf.org, I'll try and give her a list of some of the organisations of lawyers that are doing good work. Just to add one point about law, one thing we lawyers have to start doing is insisting that law needs to be framed in quite specific terms. We have far too much law. I'm particularly thinking of the EU General Farm Animals Directive, which is couched in such broad terms that nobody can enforce it. Neither enforcers nor farmers know what is expected of them. And so this is what, you know, again, it's part of what governments can use. They can say to people who are complaining, oh, we've got this wonderful law that says this, that, and the other. But in practice, it makes no difference.
I guess I would add that one of our visiting professors at the Centre for Animal Welfare is Professor Paula Sparks. So she leads the United Kingdom Association of Lawyers for Animal Welfare, and they do exist in several countries in the world. There's an equivalent in Australia and one in the US, for example, and also very actively in New Zealand with some of them. I've just published a big report on animal law reforms in New Zealand within the last week or so. But the United Kingdom one is indeed very active on seeking to work toward legal reform for animals and regularly submit to government on a range of issues. So there are those organisations. Now, Matilda de Rui asks a question in a similar vein. She asks about the potential for judicial review action against the United Kingdom government for continuing to subsidise animal agriculture and allow the provision of meals in public facilities that contain animal products when she feels public health is adversely impacted as a result. So what do you think about the potential for judicial review action against the United Kingdom government for subsidising intensive animal farming, Peter?
Yes, I know there is a movement to try and bring judicial review proceedings on this rather broad base of, you know, government, you shouldn't be continuing to support factory farming. I'd love to see it succeed, and indeed I've been in touch with one of the people involved with it and have offered to help. I think it's going to be very difficult because courts will normally only grant judicial review if you can actually show the government is acting unlawfully or so unreasonably that no reasonable minister could act in that way. And that's a hard test. One problem we've got is that till the end of December, we still had in UK law the EU treaty, which both recognised animals as sentient beings, but also crucially from this point of view, placed a legal duty on governments when formulating and implementing their policies in agriculture to pay full regard to the welfare requirements of animals. That legal duty has been dropped. So again, there isn't that legal duty that we can focus on in bringing judicial review, though the government have promised they're going to bring forward legislation to reintroduce it. I hope they will do so. So yes, I'd love to see that judicial review proceeding going ahead, but I think it's going to be quite a challenge.
All right, that would indeed be extremely interesting if that were to occur. Peter, we're up to the time that we originally had for this session. I do have a number of very interesting questions from people still on the list here, and would you be okay to carry on for another 10 minutes or so if we go through some more?
Yeah,
fantastic.
Some really interesting questions.
All right, we understand if some of our attendees may need to leave at this point, but there are some great questions coming up, so we'll carry on. Thanks, Peter. So this next one really asks about the alternatives, and it's asked by Connie. And I think the question relates to small-scale farming that is often proposed as an alternative to large-scale industrial animal farming. And then Connie says that she may have read somewhere that if we would only produce 1 gram of animal protein per person per day, if we advocated for small-scale animal farming, and this would in fact be much more destructive to the environment because grazing animals versus, say, intensively farmed animals, grazing animals require more resources, more land, water, food during their longer lifespans. So this might not actually solve the environmental problems associated with animal farming, could result in very expensive meat and dairy products that poorer people might not be able to afford to buy, making it only accessible to the wealthy. Would it be better to advocate for plant-based diets rather than small-scale farming as an alternative to industrial animal farming?
Okay, okay. There are a number of studies that suggest that animals only provide an efficient role in food production when they are consuming materials that we can't eat. So, I touched upon this huge use of cereals and soy, which is so inefficient. But if animals are being fed on grass or on the byproducts from other processes, or on that part of food waste that can't be avoided, then the animals are efficiently converting this into meat and milk. There was a big study done about 5 years ago which said that if that approach were adopted, in other words, we only feed animals on things we couldn't eat ourselves, the consumption would drop, the consumption of meat and milk would drop by about 50%. In other words, there'll be more than 1 gram a day, but it would be a big change from where we are now. And I'm not comfortable with Connie's criticism of grazing animals. Yes, they use more land, but that's all right if the land that they're using couldn't be used for arable. If it couldn't be used for other forms of food production. Though, like all these questions, it gets complex because I'm sure some people would say, yeah, okay, it couldn't be used for other food production, but it may be much better to rewild it and reforest it so that it can be absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere rather than using it for grazing animals. But I think there is a place for grazing animals, provided the standards are really high. I've been shocked quite recently at seeing the very high levels of lamb mortality in Scotland, for example. So although I and Compassion World Farming are great supporters of extensive grazing, it's got to be to high welfare standards.
Okay, thank you. This next question, again from Anonymous, notes initially the carcinogenic risk of consumption of some meat products, which are well established in studies of human health. And asks about a vegan diet. This question notes that Vegan diets are single-handedly the easiest way to avoid animal abuse, persecution, and needless killing of sentient creatures. Why do we keep purporting that animals are necessary within our diet when a well-planned plant-based whole food diet has been shown by many health practitioners and studies to be suitable for all ages and stages of life? The comment ends that to respect these sentient beings' right to life, should they not be considered as animals in their own rights and not as just a food source? So, Peter, what do you think about that?
Yes, I mean, very sympathetic to that. I totally respect people who are vegan or vegetarian. From our point of view as an organisation, we recognise that, as I said, animals can play a constructive role in agriculture. For example, again, in these extensive systems, whereas the manure that's coming from factory farms is just so huge in quantity that's a pollutant, in well-balanced extensive systems, particularly, mixed livestock crop systems, the manure can be what is really building soil fertility and quality. So there can be a really positive role. Also, we have to accept that really in most of the world we're still living in a meat-eating society, and that we're more likely to make progress on providing decent lives for animals if we can say to people, look, you don't have to stop altogether, but you must reduce a lot, and we must radically improve the welfare standards. But yes, I fully accept that there are strong arguments for vegetarian and veganism. And indeed, if you look at the scientific studies on greenhouse gas emissions, they're showing that there needs to be, very substantial reductions in meat and milk consumption if we're to be able to meet the Paris climate targets. So there are all sorts of reasons, beyond animal welfare, climate change, deforestation, quality of our soils, why we need to radically reduce meat consumption. I mean, when I say radically, I'm talking about 50% or more. 50% would probably be the lowest.
Okay, thank you. This next question from Katrina notes the lobbying power of animal agricultural organisations and speaks to what you said previously about the impacts of marketing on understanding of animal welfare. She says, I really hope the tide is turning. Information is so important to inform the public so that it demands reform. How is CIWF helping to drive this reform? What can we do? Where's it best for us to put our efforts? How critical is it to have animals re-recognised as sentient beings following Brexit?
Right. I didn't quite. What was the question asking that we should do? I mean,
there's a couple of parts. One is asking what is CIWF doing as an organisation to help drive the reform of social perspectives about animals used in farming systems and policy and legislative change, I think. And the other question asks about what should we do? Where is it best for us to put our efforts?
Okay. Obviously, as an organisation, we try to all the time educate the public, and not just in the UK. We have offices in many countries worldwide about both the cruelty involved in factory farming and the environmental and health impacts. I think the question also touched upon something that's really dear to my heart, which is this role of the big multinationals. All these companies. I mean, I'm particularly incensed by the big global grain traders. These are the big companies that move cereals and soy around the world, and are so dependent on factory farming for their products. We've got a totally, in the developed world, unhealthy relationship between crop production and animal production, and it's one that's very rarely recognised. I said in the talk that 2/3 of EU cereals are being used to feed animals, and so the EU cereal sector is highly dependent on factory farming of animals for its products, just like the factory farming section is highly dependent on the cereal section. The two of them have this really unhealthy, damaging danse macabre relationship, and I'd love to see governments and the public saying, look, we're no longer willing to see these big multinationals, the big pig breeding companies and so on, so dominating agriculture. The part of the problem, Andrew, is that people know the names of the big retailers. If they want to do something, they can write to Tesco, they can write to Sainsbury's, and these companies are quite sensitive because they're dependent on their reputation. Hardly anybody could. I doubt if anybody in the audience, apart from one or two, could name a big international grain trader, a big pig breeding company. So these companies couldn't really care less about their reputation. I want to also talk about something which I don't have time to talk about. We as a movement and we members of the public have been very good at putting pressure on retailers, and with quite a success. But where does the money come from for factory farms? Not just ours in the UK, but in China, in Vietnam, in India, worldwide. It's coming from big financial institutions. Those are both big public bodies like the World Bank, but they're also the big commercial banks. And there you have got high street names like NatWest and Barclays, and they pour hundreds of millions into factory farming worldwide. And we're working really hard to say, no, you have to stop this. You have to stop doing it from an animal welfare point of view, but also because factory farming is so damaging to climate change and the environment. So anybody who wanted to start thinking of all them and start writing to NatWest or whoever their bank is, yes, contact us and we can discuss this further. So yeah, sadly, there's some really important topics, these big multinationals and the big financial bodies that we need to focus on.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. We're really out of time at the moment, and we've gone through most of the questions that have come in. Thank you for being willing to answer any additional ones. I know you gave out your email address before. I think it was peter at CIWF.org, if I'm correct.
Yes.
And thanks for such a great review. It's touched, I think, on some of the top issues of our time, certainly climate change and biodiversity loss. We know that animal agriculture in its current form is the cause of around about 16% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's one of the top contributors to climate change and biodiversity loss. And clearly, it's also a major contributor to pandemic risks as well, with the extremely large numbers of animals densely packed together in relatively stressful and unhygienic conditions that consequently lower their immune systems, their immunocompetence. So it's an ideal system for the transmission of disease and, of course, the potential jumping of those diseases into human beings as well. And that's also clearly one of the big issues of our times at the moment. So it's been great to have you with us. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to go and end the presentation in a moment, but before I do, I'd just like to flag up to our listeners that the next one of these presentations in our series will be in a couple of weeks' time. We're going to have veterinarian Dr. Luke Gamble, who is quite a famous veterinarian. He's going to be talking about his work helping to try to eliminate rabies in developing nations through vaccination programs for the street dogs that are often sort of semi-wild in some developing regions of the world. And also his organisation, Worldwide Veterinary Services, who send disaster response teams and veterinary teams to animal disaster regions around the world and also developing nations generally to try to help people provide basic veterinary health care for animals in developing nations. So that'll be Thursday, 25th of March, in about 2 weeks at 12:30, also via Microsoft Teams Live, as this one is. Details for that are on the Centre for Animal Welfare website at the University of Winchester, and we're very quick and easy to find by Google searching. This has been, as I say, one of the largest events we've had to date. Thank you very much to all the attendees and for the wonderful questions that have come in. I hope you have all appreciated it as much as we have, as I have. So I will go ahead and actually ask Chloe, if I may, to end the event now, because I can't seem to do so here. Thank you, everyone.